May 5th, 2009, 6:58 a.m. Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow's radio crackles to life while he's still in his patrol car. A neighbor needs a welfare check. The neighbor's name is Chris Coleman. The address is 2854 Robert Drive, just 3 houses down from Barlow's own home. Something about the call makes Barlow's stomach tighten. He's been watching this house for months, installing security cameras, logging suspicious activity, all because of the letters, the threats, the promises of violence written by someone who, when Chris Coleman would be away from home, someone whose families schedule better than they did themselves. Barlow meets Officer Steve Patton in front of the house at 7:01 a.m. They ring the doorbell. Nothing. They knock. No response. The morning is quiet in this peaceful suburb across the river from St. Louis. Too quiet. They circle around back. That's when Patton sees it. A basement window, wide open, the screen removed and leaning carefully against a patio table. Not ripped, not broken, placed. Barlow climbs through first. The smell hits him before his feet touch the basement floor. Chemical, sharp, spray paint. His flashlight sweeps across the walls as he moves toward the stairs leading up to the main level. Then he sees them. Blood-red letters, 6 feet tall, dripping down the white walls like wounds. You have paid. His radio is already at his mouth. We need backup at 2854 Robert Drive. We need it now. They climb the stairs. More words, more threats, obscenities, scrawled across every wall in that same blood-red paint. Punished. I am always watching. A door opens downstairs. Someone's entering through the basement window. Barlow and Patton freeze, hands moving to their weapons. Footsteps on the basement stairs. It's Chris Coleman, home from the gym, athletic shorts, t-shirt damp with sweat, car keys in his hand. Stay outside, Barlow tells him. We're clearing the house. They move to the second floor. The smell is stronger here. Paint mixed with something else. Something organic. Wrong. The first bedroom on the right. Barlow's flashlight catches blonde hair spread across white sheets. A woman, face down, naked, completely still. The early morning light filtering through the curtains illuminates her back, her arms, the unnatural angle of her neck. Sherry Coleman, 31 years old, not sleeping, dead. Barlow forces himself to move to the next room. Garrett's room, 11 years old. Star Wars posters on the walls. The boy is in his bed. Ligature marks around his neck. Red spray paint on his incredible Hulk. Sheets. Dead. The last room. Gavin, 9 years old. For hours. 3 bodies. 3 victims. It's 7:05 a.m. Barlow walks back outside to where Chris Coleman is waiting on the front lawn. He has to tell a man that his entire family has been murdered, that his 2 young sons are gone, that his wife is dead in their bedroom. Chris Coleman starts to cry. He doesn't ask to go inside. He doesn't run toward the house. He doesn't demand to see them. He just cries. Standing there in his gym clothes, keys still in his hand, as the morning sun rises over Columbia, Illinois, Chris Coleman becomes either the most tragic figure in this quiet suburb or the most dangerous. This is the moment Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow starts to wonder which one. What you're about to hear didn't make national headlines for years. The police body camera footage from inside that house, the text messages sent during the funeral, the matching promise rings, the recordings of interrogations, where a trained security expert thought he could outsmart detectives. We expose cases like this every day, where perfect family men aren't what they seem, where entire communities are fooled, where children pay the price for adult secrets. Hit subscribe right now, because when the next perfect father tries to get away with murder, you'll be the first to know what the police won't tell you. Don't let them control the narrative. Columbia, Illinois sits just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri. If St. Louis is the loud, troubled older sibling, Columbia is the quiet one who goes to church and mows the lawn every Saturday morning. Population 10,000. Crime rate 69%, safer than most American, and everyone watches out for each other's children. The homes here are newer construction, built in the housing boom of the 2000s. Neat lawns, 2-car garages, basketball hoops on every third driveway, American flags fluttering from front porches. This isn't the kind of neighborhood where you check if you locked your door at night. 2854 Robert Drive fits right in. A 2-story house with beige siding and brown trim, a wooden fence surrounding the backyard. Nothing distinguishes it from the homes on either side except for one detail most neighbors wouldn't notice. Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow lives just 3 houses away. and for the past 6 months he's been watching this house very carefully. On May 5th, 2009, the temperature was a comfortable 65 degrees at sunrise, the kind of morning where you might open your windows to let fresh air into the house. Someone did exactly that at 2854 Robert Drive. They opened a basement window, removed the screen, placed it carefully against patio furniture. Then they went inside and murdered 3 people while they slept. This kind of thing doesn't happen in Columbia, Illinois, except it did. And if it could happen here in this safe suburb, with its good schools and friendly neighbors, it could happen anywhere. Sherry Coleman wasn't the kind of person you forgot after meeting her once. Born Sherry Weiss on September 10th, 1977, she grew up in Chicago, the middle child in a close-knit family. Her friends from high school remembered her as the girl who organized surprise birthday parties for people she barely knew, the one who left encouraging notes in lockers, who remembered everyone's pets' names and asked about them weeks later. She met Chris Coleman in 1997 when she was just 19 years old. He was in the Marines, stationed near where she was working. The attraction was immediate. Chris was handsome, disciplined, a man in uniform who talked about serving God and country with equal conviction. They married on May 29, 1998, less than a year after meeting. By all accounts, Sherry transformed seamlessly into the role of military wife, then security professional's wife, then mother. She had Garrett in 1997, then Gavin in 1999. She became a full-time homemaker, dedicating herself to creating a warm, loving environment for her sons. Garrett, 11 years old in May 2009, was the kind of kid who collected rocks from every vacation and labeled them in careful handwriting. He played baseball. He loved Star Wars. He had a gap-toothed smile and his mother's easy laugh. His teachers said he was kind to the kids other students picked on. Gavin, 9 years old, was more reserved than his older brother, but just as sweet. He liked building things with Legos, following instructions exactly, then displaying his creations on his bedroom shelf. He was particular about how his belongings were arranged. He'd inherited his father's organizational skills and his mother's gentle heart. The Coleman family attended church regularly. They participated in community events. Chris worked as head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the largest Christian organizations in America. Joyce Meyer herself was a best-selling author and televangelist with millions of followers worldwide. Chris traveled with her to conferences, handled threat assessment, managed security protocols for events that drew thousands of attendees. It was prestigious work, important work, work that required absolute trust, because Chris was responsible for protecting someone who received death threats from religious extremists, critics, and unstable individuals on a regular basis. The irony of this would become apparent soon enough. Sherry made the best of Chris's frequent absences. She had his parents nearby, Ron and Connie Coleman, both pastors themselves. She had neighbors she trusted. She had her routines with the boys, school drop-offs and pickups, homework help, dinner around the kitchen table. She kept a journal. In it, she wrote about her struggles with Chris's travel schedule, how lonely she felt, how she wondered sometimes if he still loved her the way he used to. But she also wrote about her hopes for their marriage, her prayers for their family, her gratitude for her sons. On May 4th, 2009, one day before she died, Sherry Coleman made spaghetti for dinner, Garrett's favorite. She helped Gavin with a math worksheet. She texted Chris to ask what time he'd be home. She laid out clothes for the boys for school the next day. She went to bed around 10:30 p.m., as she usually did. She had no idea she'd just lived the last ordinary day of her life. She had no idea that someone had been planning her death for months. She had no idea that the person who would kill her was already inside the house. November 2008, 6 months before the murders. The email arrived in Chris Coleman's inbox on November 4th, 2008. The sender, destroychris@gmail.com. The subject line, Chris's family. Chris opened it at work. Joyce Meyer Ministries headquarters in Fenton, Missouri, a sprawling complex housing the organization's television production studios, offices, and ministry operations. Chris worked in the security department, a small team responsible for protecting Joyce, her family, and assessing threats from the public. He read the email once, then again, then he forwarded it to his supervisor. The message was filled with profanity and threats, violent, explicit language about what the sender wanted to do to Chris's family. But the core message was clear. Joyce Meyer needed to stop preaching, and Chris needed to quit his job, protecting her. If they didn't comply, there would be consequences. "They are dead," the email read, If Joyce doesn't quit preaching then they will die. During the Houston conference, I will kill them all as they sleep. The email referenced specific upcoming events: a conference in Houston, a book tour, a trip to India. These were all on Joyce Meyer's schedule. Information that wasn't exactly secret but required some knowledge of the ministry's operations to access. Chris reported the email to his supervisors immediately. They contacted local police, but email threats to prominent religious figures weren't uncommon. The email address was clearly fake. The threats were disturbing but vague. There was no way to identify the sender. Everyone agreed Chris should be cautious, watch his surroundings, maybe consider some additional security measures at home. What nobody knew was that Chris Coleman had met someone new 9 days earlier. Her name was Tara Lintz. Tara was a cocktail waitress from Florida, blonde and vivacious, with an easy smile and a complicated past. She was actually friends with Sherry from high school, a year younger, part of the same social circle. They'd kept in loose touch over the years through Facebook and occasional text messages. I need you to comment the exact time you're watching this right now. Don't think about it. Just drop the timestamp. We want to know who is stumbling on this story by 2 a.m. in the morning, eyes wide awake. On October 26, 2008, Sherry called Tara with a suggestion. Joyce Meyer was doing a conference in Florida, and Chris would be there working security. Wouldn't it be nice if Tara attended? She could see the conference, maybe meet up with Chris afterward, catch up on old times. Tara went. She met Chris, and something clicked. Chris was handsome, successful, well-traveled. He talked about his work protecting one of America's most famous Christian leaders. He was charming, attentive, different from the men Tara typically met in Florida bars. They exchanged phone numbers. Within a week, Chris's family started receiving death threats. Within a month, Chris and Tara were involved in a full-blown affair. The timing would later seem too perfect to be coincidental, but in November 2008, as that first threatening email arrived, Chris Coleman played the role of concerned husband and father flawlessly. He showed the email to Sherry. They discussed what it meant, whether they should be worried. Sherry wanted to take it seriously. Chris assured her they would. He contacted their neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow, who lived just a few houses down. Barlow agreed to keep an eye on things, watch for suspicious activity, maybe catch whoever was leaving these threats, because there would be more threats, more letters, more evidence that someone dangerous had the Coleman family in their sights. In December 2008, Chris flew to Florida for a ministry event. He met up with Tara. Their relationship became physical. They took explicit photos and videos together, documenting their affair with the casual confidence of people who believed they'd never be caught. Chris returned home to Sherry and the boys for Christmas. He played the devoted father, opening presents with Garrett and Gavin, attending church services with his family, posting photos on Facebook of their perfect holiday celebration. His work phone buzzed constantly with messages from Tara. Early January 2009 brought another threat, this time a physical letter left in the Coleman's mailbox. Barlow's security camera caught nothing. Whoever delivered it knew exactly where the camera's blind spots were. The letter was filled with the same profane language, the same religious overtones, the same demands that Chris quit his job. "Deny your God publicly or else," it read. "No more opportunities. Time is running out for you and your family." The word opportunities was misspelled, a detail investigators would remember later. Chris showed this letter to police as well, filed another report, expressed concern for his family's safety, all while texting Tara that he missed her, that he was counting down the days until he could see her again, that she made him happier than he'd been in years. The threats were real. The fear in Chris's voice when he talked to police was convincing. The concern from his employer was genuine. Joyce Meyer's organization took threats seriously. They had protocols in place. They offered to increase security measures around Chris and his family. But here's what nobody realized. The best way to make threats seem credible is to actually carry them out. And Chris Coleman was planning something nobody around him could imagine. In March 2009, Tara started to pressure Chris about his marriage. The affair was no longer enough for her. She wanted commitment. She wanted him to leave Sherry. She wanted to be Mrs. Coleman, not the other woman. Chris told her he was working on it. He was talking to a lawyer about divorce. He needed time to do it right, to protect his job, to make sure he didn't lose everything. But divorce wasn't compatible with employment at Joyce Meyer Ministries. The organization had clear policies about moral conduct. Adultery was grounds for immediate termination. A security professional who couldn't keep his own marriage secure wasn't someone who could be trusted to protect Joyce Meyer. Chris knew this. His co-workers would testify to it later. Everyone who worked at the ministry understood. If you had an affair, if you got divorced under questionable circumstances, you were gone. And Chris couldn't afford to lose his job. The salary was good. The benefits were excellent. The prestige was intoxicating. He traveled the world, rubbed shoulders with celebrities and political figures, wore a suit and an earpiece, and protected someone millions of people admired. Going back to being just another ex-Marine with a security guard job wasn't acceptable. So Chris made a different choice. In April 2009, another letter arrived at the Coleman house. "I am giving you the last warning," it began. "I have warned you to stop traveling and to stop carrying on with this fake religious life of stealing people's money." The language was more aggressive this time, more specific, more violent. "Your worst nightmare is about to happen." Barlow installed more cameras, increased his patrols past the house, watched for anything suspicious. But he was watching for an outside threat. He was watching for a stranger. He never considered that the threat was coming from inside 2854 Robert Drive, that the man he was trying to protect was the same man planning the crime. Chris called in sick to work on May 4th, 2009. This was unusual for him. He rarely took sick days. His supervisor noted it, but didn't think much of it. People get sick sometimes. What Chris did that day, alone in the house while Sherry and the boys went about their normal routine, remains partially unknown. But investigators would later theorize this was his preparation day, the day he gathered supplies, finalized his plan, steeled himself for what he intended to do. He told Tara the divorce papers would be ready on May 5th, that he would serve them to Sherry that day, that soon, very soon, they could be together officially. Tara believed him. She marked it in her calendar. But there were no divorce papers. There was never going to be a divorce. There was only May 5th, 2009, and the plan Chris had been building toward for months. A plan that required his family to die. May 5th, 2009. The timeline. Chris Coleman's story was simple and consistent. He woke up around 5:30 a.m. as he usually did on workout days. He got dressed in his gym clothes. He said goodbye to Sherry, who was still in bed, sleeping. The boys were asleep in their rooms. Everything was normal. He drove from Columbia across the river to his gym in South St. Louis County, about a 25-minute drive. He arrived at the gym around 6 a.m. He worked out. He made 2 phone calls to Sherry around 6:42 a.m. and 6:46 a.m. She didn't answer. He sent her a text message. No response. This was unusual, he would later tell police. Sherry always answered her phone in the morning. She was an early riser. She'd be awake by now, probably getting the boys ready for school. Around 6:50 a.m., concerned because of the threatening letters his family had been receiving, Chris called his neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow. He asked Barlow to check on the house. Chris began driving home. He called Barlow again while crossing the Jefferson Barracks Bridge around 6:58 a.m. Barlow and Officer Patton arrived at the Coleman house at 7:01 a.m. They found the open basement window, entered the house, discovered the spray-painted messages, and then found the bodies. Chris arrived home at 7:03 a.m., entering through the same basement window the officers had used. They told him to stay outside while they finished clearing the house. At 7:05 a.m., they informed Chris that his wife and 2 sons were dead. It was a clean timeline, easy to follow, verified by phone records, by the gym's security footage, showing Chris's car in the parking lot, by the timestamps on his calls. But there were problems, small ones at first, cracks in the foundation of his story that would gradually widen into chasms. Problem 1. The gym footage showed Chris's car entering the parking lot at 5:43 a.m., not 6 o'clock a.m., as he claimed. This was earlier than his usual arrival time. The footage showed him leaving at 6:34 a.m., a shorter workout than normal. Why would Chris misremember his arrival time? Why would he leave earlier than usual? Problem 2. The phone calls to Sherry. Chris said he called because she wasn't answering, and this worried him. But phone records showed he'd called her cell phone, not the house phone. If he was truly concerned about her safety, wouldn't he try both numbers? Wouldn't he call multiple times in quick succession rather than just twice with several minutes between calls? Problem 3. The text message Chris sent to Sherry was oddly casual for someone who claimed to be increasingly worried. "What are you doing?" it read. Not, "Are you okay?" or "Please call me back." Just a standard everyday text. Problem 4. Chris's reaction when told his family was dead. He cried. He appeared shocked. But he didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if they were really dead or just injured. He didn't try to go inside. He didn't demand to see them. He didn't ask if they'd suffered. He just cried and stayed on the lawn. Problem 5. The basement window. It was open, but the screen had been removed and placed carefully against patio furniture. Not torn, not broken, not tossed aside. Placed. As if whoever went through that window didn't want to damage it. As if they planned to put it back later and wanted it to be unharmed. Problem 6. The spray paint. Blood red spray paint on the walls, threatening messages, profanity, but no spray paint cans found anywhere in the house or on the property. Whoever did this brought paint with them and took the cans when they left. That suggested planning, premeditation. Problem 7. The actual cause of death. All 3 victims had been strangled using a ligature, likely a cord or rope, but no ligature was found at the scene. The killer took it with them. Again, this suggested someone who was thinking clearly enough to remove evidence, not a crime of passion or rage, but something calculated. Problem 8. The lack of forced entry. Yes, the basement window was open, but there were no tool marks, no signs of prying or breaking. The window opened easily as if someone knew it would, as if someone had unlocked it from the inside before leaving the house. Problem 9. Sherry's hair. Several of her hairs were found on Gavin's body, suggesting she was killed first, and the killer moved from her bedroom to the boys' rooms, with her hair on their clothes or hands. This meant the killer went from victim to victim methodically. This wasn't a spontaneous attack. This was systematic execution. Problem 10. The time of death. The medical examiner estimated the victims had been dead for approximately 2 to 3 hours when discovered at 7:05 a.m. That meant they died roughly between 4 o'clock a.m. and 5 o'clock a.m. Chris claimed he left the house around 5:30 a.m., but if the murders happened between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock a.m., and Chris didn't leave until 5:30 a.m., then either the medical examiner's estimate was wrong, or Chris was in the house when his family died, or Chris was the one who killed them. Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow stood in the Coleman living room that morning, looking at the spray-painted walls, thinking about his neighbor, thinking about the man he'd been trying to protect for 6 months, the man who worked in security and would know how to avoid cameras, the man who had access to his own home and could open windows from the inside, the man who knew exactly when he would be away from the house and alone, the man who had been so cooperative with police, so willing to show them every threatening letter, so concerned about his family's safety. And Barlow thought, what if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if the person sending threats and the person receiving them are the same person? What if Chris Coleman has been setting this up for months? The investigation into the Coleman family murders moved quickly. Within hours of discovering the bodies, the Illinois State Police had taken over the case, bringing in forensic specialists, criminal profilers, and a team of detectives who had no personal connection to Chris Coleman. They started with the obvious question, who would want to kill a security professional's wife and children? The threatening letters pointed toward religious extremism. Someone angry at Joyce Meyer, at her ministry, at her message. Someone who saw Chris as complicit in what they viewed as spiritual fraud. But religious extremists who threaten televangelists don't typically follow through. They send letters, they post angry screeds online, they show up at conferences to protest. They don't break into suburban homes and systematically strangle families in their sleep. The investigators looked at the evidence more carefully. The spray paint messages, "You have paid, punished, I am always watching." These were written in large letters, taking considerable time to complete. The killer would have needed to be in the house for an extended period, making noise, taking risks. Yet no neighbors heard anything, no dogs barked, no car was seen leaving the neighborhood at an unusual hour. This suggested familiarity, someone who belonged in the house, whose presence wouldn't raise suspicion. The ligature marks on the victims' necks. The pressure required to strangle someone to death is significant. It takes several minutes, continuous pressure, and considerable strength. The killer strangled 3 people in succession. This required physical capability and emotional detachment. Most murder victims know their killer. Most strangulation victims are killed by intimate partners. The staging. Everything about the crime scene felt staged. The threatening messages on the walls were too perfect, too obviously designed to point investigators toward the theory of an outside religious extremist. The open window with the carefully placed screen, the lack of any actual forced entry, the complete absence of the murder weapon in the spray paint cans. Real crimes are messy. Perpetrators leave evidence, they make mistakes, they panic and forget details. This crime scene was too clean, too controlled. It looked like someone with law enforcement or security training had planned it. Someone like Chris Coleman. The investigators brought Chris in for an interview on May 5th, just hours after his family's bodies were discovered. He came willingly, eager to help, cooperative. He sat across from detectives in a small interview room and walked them through his story again. The detectives listened. They nodded. They asked clarifying questions. Then they asked about his marriage. Chris said it was good, strong. They had their challenges like any couple, but they loved each other. They were committed to their family, to their faith, to working through difficulties. The detectives asked if he'd ever been unfaithful. No, Chris said. Never. He took his marriage vows seriously. The detectives asked about Tara Lintz. Chris's expression changed, just slightly. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or calculation. Tara was a friend, he explained. A friend of Sherry's from high school. He'd met her when they went to Florida on vacation. They stayed in touch. He talked to her sometimes when he needed someone to confide in, when the stress of his job got to be too much. Just a friend. The detectives asked if they could see his phone. His work phone, specifically. Chris hesitated. Then he agreed he had nothing to hide. The forensic technicians examined his work phone while Chris waited. What they found would change everything. Hundreds of calls to a Florida number. Tara's number. Calls that lasted hours. Late-night calls. Early morning calls. Calls made while Chris was supposedly spending time with his family. Text messages. Thousands of them. Intimate messages. Explicit messages. Messages that made it very clear that Chris and Tara were far more than friends. Photos, videos. Evidence of an affair that had been going on for months. The detectives confronted Chris with this evidence. He admitted to the affair. But it wasn't serious, he said. It was just physical. Just a way to deal with stress. It didn't mean anything. He loved his wife. He loved his family. Did Sherry know about Tara? Chris said she suspected something. They'd had conversations about divorce. But he was trying to work things out. He didn't want to lose his family. The investigators asked Chris to take a polygraph test. He agreed. He failed. The specific questions where the polygraph indicated deception. Did you kill your wife? Did you kill your sons? Did you write the threatening letters? To all three, Chris answered no. The polygraph suggested he was lying. Polygraphs aren't admissible in court. They're not always accurate. But they're another crack in the foundation, another piece of evidence that suggests someone isn't telling the truth. The investigators went to Florida and interviewed Tara Lintz. She was devastated by the news of the murders. She'd seen it on the news, couldn't believe it, thought maybe it was a different Coleman family. She cooperated fully with police. She showed them her phone, her computer, her calendar. What she showed them was worse than the investigators expected. Tara wasn't just having an affair with Chris. She was planning a future with him. She had marked a wedding date in her calendar. She had notes about their future together. She had promised rings sitting in her jewelry box, a gift from Chris. She had taken photos of everything. Chris in her apartment, Chris in her bed, Chris on vacation with her in Hawaii. Time-stamped, dated photos that proved Chris had lied about the extent and seriousness of the relationship. More importantly, Tara could provide context. She told investigators that Chris had been complaining about his marriage for months, that he wanted out but couldn't afford a divorce, that his job at Joyce Meyer Ministries was too important, and they'd fire him if they found out about the affair. She said Chris had told her he was getting divorce papers ready, that he would serve them to Sherry on May 5th. May 5th, the same day Sherry died. Tara had texts from Chris backing this up. He'd told her the papers were ready, that everything was going to change, that soon they could be together openly. But there were no divorce papers. Investigators checked with every divorce attorney in the St. Louis area. None of them had been contacted by Chris Coleman. There was no filing, no paperwork in progress, no evidence that Chris had taken any actual steps toward divorce. He'd lied to Tara about the divorce papers. The investigators started to develop a theory. Chris Coleman wanted out of his marriage, but couldn't afford to get divorced because he'd lose his job. Tara was pressuring him to leave Sherry. The affair was getting harder to hide. His co-workers were starting to suspect something. The walls were closing in. So he created a different solution. He wrote threatening letters to himself, establishing a pattern of an outside threat against his family. He made sure police knew about the threats, made sure there was documentation, made sure everyone believed someone dangerous was targeting the Colemans. Then, when the time was right, he murdered his family and staged it to look like the threatened attack had finally happened. He'd be the victim. The grieving widower, the traumatized father. He'd have sympathy from everyone. He'd have Tara. He'd keep his job because he'd done nothing wrong. His family had been murdered by a religious extremist. How could Joyce Meyer fire him in those circumstances? It was a perfect plan, except Chris Coleman had made mistakes. the Illinois State Police brought in forensic linguistics experts to analyze the threatening letters and emails. These specialists compare writing styles, word choices, grammar patterns, and spelling errors to determine authorship. They compared the threatening communications to Chris Coleman's known writing samples, emails he'd sent from his work account, text messages from his personal phone, posts he'd made on social media. The analysis came back with high confidence. The same person who wrote Chris Coleman's normal communications also wrote the threatening letters. Specific patterns matched, unusual spelling errors, particular phrase constructions, similar grammar mistakes. The word opportunities misspelled in the threatening letter was spelled the same incorrect way in one of Chris's work emails. More damning, the destroychris@gmail.com account had been created from an IP address that traced back to a computer in the Coleman house, the same computer Chris used. The forensic team examined Chris's computers more thoroughly. They found evidence that he'd researched how long spray paint takes to dry, how to avoid leaving DNA evidence, how to create anonymous email accounts. All of these searches happened in the weeks before the murders. They found search terms. How long does it take to strangle someone? Time of death determination. CSI techniques. Chris had been planning this, learning how to do it, making sure he understood the forensic evidence police would look for. The paint itself provided another clue. The specific brand and color of red spray paint used on the walls at the crime scene was Valspar Cherry Red. A partial can of the same paint was found in Chris's father's garage 3 miles away. Chris's father confirmed that Chris had borrowed items from the garage before. He had a key he could access at any time. The timeline became clearer with this information. Chris hadn't left for the gym at 5:30 a.m. as he claimed. He'd left earlier, around 4:30 a.m. But he didn't go to the gym immediately. He drove to a dumpster behind a business complex in Columbia, about 2 miles from his house. Security footage from a nearby business captured his vehicle at this location at 4:47 a.m. Investigators searched that dumpster. They found spray paint cans, Valspar Cherry Red, and they found something else. A ligature, a length of cord that matched the marks on the victims' necks. The items were sent for forensic analysis. Chris's DNA was found on the spray paint can nozzle. Fibers from his gym clothes were on the cord. Chris Coleman had murdered his family, disposed of the evidence, and then driven to his gym to establish his alibi. The medical examiner refined the time of death estimate based on new information about the house's temperature and other factors. The victims died between 3:30 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. Chris's phone records showed his phone was connected to his home Wi-Fi until 4:29 a.m. It disconnected at that time and remained off cellular towers until 4:45 a.m., consistent with driving from his house to the dumpster, but he'd left his phone off to avoid creating a GPS trail between the house and the dumpster. But he'd forgotten that his phone automatically logged Wi-Fi connections. That digital fingerprint put him in the house at the time of the murders. Investigators interviewed everyone at Joyce Meyer Ministries. They learned that Chris's affair had been discovered by his coworkers about a month before the murders. His supervisor, Daniel Meyer, Joyce's son, had confronted him about suspicious phone calls to Florida. Chris had lied, saying the calls were to a man, Tara's fictional husband, seeking marriage advice. Daniel had accepted this explanation but noted it in Chris's file. Other coworkers testified that Chris had seemed stressed in recent weeks, distracted. He'd lost weight. He'd been shorter-tempered than usual. One coworker, Christine, remembered Chris asking in December about privacy settings on his work phone. He'd wanted to know if anyone could see photos sent to his device. She'd told him no, messages were private. Christine had later checked Chris's phone records at Daniel Meyer's request after Sherry called Christine saying Chris wanted a divorce. That's when they'd discovered the extent of the calls to Florida. But they hadn't fired him. They'd confronted him, he'd explained it away, and they'd decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. If they'd fired him then, would Sherry and the boys still be alive? The investigation revealed another crucial piece of information. Chris had researched his wife's life insurance policy the week before the murders. She had a $250,000 policy with Chris as the beneficiary. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start over, enough to make it worth the risk. Tara provided one final damning piece of evidence. She gave investigators her phone and computer, including one item she'd forgotten about, a photo taken of her and Chris kissing. The metadata showed it was taken on October 21st, 2008. Both Chris and Tara had told investigators that their affair started in late November 2008 after they met at the Joyce Meyer conference. The photo proved they were lying. They'd been together weeks earlier than they admitted. More importantly, it meant Chris and Tara's relationship predated the first threatening email by 2 weeks. The timeline investigators constructed looked like this. October 21st, 2008. Chris and Tara begin their affair. November 4th, 2008. First threatening email sent from destroychris@gmail.com, written by Chris. December 2008. Affair becomes physical. Chris begins leaving threatening letters in his own mailbox, careful to avoid his neighbor's security camera. January 2009. Chris tells Tara he's planning to divorce Sherry. In reality, he's planning something else. April 2009. Final threatening letter delivered. Your worst nightmare is about to happen. May 4th, 2009. Chris calls in sick to work. Unusual for him. He makes final preparations. May 5th, 2009. Between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m., Chris murders Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin using a ligature. He spray paints threatening messages on the walls. He disposes of evidence in a dumpster at 4:47 a.m. He arrives at his gym at 5:43 a.m. He calls Sherry twice and texts her to establish that he's trying to reach her. He calls his neighbor to report concern and drives home. He plays the role of devastated husband and father, but the evidence tells the truth. Chris Coleman had spent 6 months building a narrative of an outside threat, creating sympathy, establishing his alibi, all so he could murder his family and walk away free. He almost succeeded. Then tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been to Columbia, Illinois, if you know anyone from there, or if you live anywhere near St. Louis, comment, I know this area. The reason why will become disturbing in exactly 3 minutes when you realize how many families, just like the Colemans, might be in your own neighborhood right now. How many perfect marriages are hiding something deadly. Let's get back to the story. The Illinois State Police assembled their case against Chris Coleman methodically. They knew they needed overwhelming evidence because Chris had no criminal history, strong community support, and a compelling cover story. A religious extremist targeting a televangelist security chief's family was believable. Juries would want to believe it. So investigators made sure there was no room for doubt. The forensic linguistics report was devastating. The expert Dr. Carol Chasky testified that she'd analyzed over 100 different data points across the threatening letters and Chris's known writings. She found consistent patterns in punctuation usage. Chris frequently used quotation marks incorrectly, placing them around phrases that didn't require them. The threatening letters did the same. Capitalization patterns. Both Chris's regular emails and the threatening letters capitalized words mid-sentence for emphasis, a relatively uncommon writing tick. Phrase construction. Chris often used 3-word imperatives like, get ready now, or stop this immediately. The threatening letters contained similar constructions. Deny your God publicly, stop traveling immediately. Spelling errors, beyond opportunities. There were other consistent misspellings across both document sets. Definitely instead of definitely. Separately instead of separately. The probability that someone other than Chris wrote those letters less than 1%. The computer forensics were equally damning. Chris had attempted to delete his internet search history, but nothing is ever truly deleted. Forensic specialists recovered. Searches for how to commit murder without getting caught, March 2009. Searches for ligature strangulation time, April 2009. Searches for life insurance payout after murder, April 2009. Multiple visits to websites about forensic investigation techniques, research into spray paint, drying times, and whether spray paint could be traced. Chris had also visited several divorce attorney websites, but never actually contacted any of them. He'd been researching his options, realized divorce would cost him everything, and chosen a different path. The physical evidence placed Chris at the scene during the time of death. His DNA under Sherry's fingernails suggested she'd scratched him during the attack. Chris had visible scratch marks on his arms when police interviewed him on May 5th. He claimed they were from working out at the gym, but the pattern didn't match exercise equipment. The pattern matched fingernails desperately clawing at an attacker's arms. Fibers from Chris's gym shorts were found in Sherry's bedroom and in both boys' rooms. Chris claimed he'd been in those rooms the previous evening saying goodnight to his family. But these were fresh fiber transfers, the kind that comes from recent contact, not from walking through a room hours earlier. The spray paint analysis revealed something subtle but significant. When spray paint is applied to a wall, it creates a specific splatter pattern. The threatening messages on the Coleman's walls showed a right-handed application pattern with slightly more pressure on the right side of each stroke. Chris Coleman is right-handed. More tellingly, the height of the spray-painted messages corresponded with Chris's height. Someone 6 feet tall would naturally paint at a certain level. A shorter person or a taller person would paint at different heights. The messages were at precisely the height someone Chris's size would comfortably spray. The timeline evidence was perhaps most damaging. Chris's gym had security cameras and a keycard entry system. The data showed 4:29 a.m. Chris's phone disconnects from home Wi-Fi. 4:47 a.m. Chris's vehicle captured on security footage near the dumpster where evidence was later found. 5:43 a.m. Chris's keycard used to enter gym, not 6:00 a.m. as he initially claimed. 5:44 a.m. Security footage shows Chris entering gym. 6:34 a.m. Chris's keycard used to exit gym. 6:42 a.m. Chris makes first call to Sherry from his car. 6:46. Chris makes second call to Sherry. 6:47. Chris sends text to Sherry. What are you doing? 6:53 a.m. Chris calls Detective Barlow while supposedly worried about his family. 6:58 a.m. Chris calls Barlow again from the bridge. 7:03 a.m. Chris arrives home. The gap between leaving his house, 4:29 a.m., and arriving at the gym, 5:43 a.m., was over an hour. Chris claimed he left around 5:30 a.m. and drove straight to the gym, which should have taken about 25 minutes. Where was he during that extra hour? The prosecution's theory? He was murdering his family, 3:30, 4:30 a.m., spray painting the walls, disposing of evidence in the dumpster, 4:47 a.m., and then driving to the gym to establish his alibi. Cell phone tower data supported this timeline. Chris's phone pinged towers along the route from his house to the dumpster to the gym at times that matched the prosecution's theory exactly. The financial evidence added context to motive. Chris earned approximately $65,000 per year at Joyce Meyer Ministries. Decent but not wealthy. Sherry's life insurance policy was $250,000. He also had life insurance policies on the boys, $50,000 each. Total insurance payout if his entire family died, $350,000. Not enough to kill for, perhaps, but enough to make starting over with Tara more comfortable. Enough to make the risk worth considering. Investigators discovered Chris had been looking at houses in Florida near where Tara lived. He'd browsed real estate websites, saved listings, calculated mortgage payments. He'd been planning his new life with Tara for months before the murders. The evidence from Tara's devices was particularly revealing. She'd kept everything. Text messages going back to October 2008, emails, photos, videos, even voicemails Chris had left her. In these communications, Chris complained constantly about Sherry. She didn't understand him. She was boring. She'd let herself go. She was too focused on the kids. The passion was gone from their marriage. But he also wrote things that were chilling in retrospect. Sometimes I wish I could just make everything go away and start over. January 2009. If I could just erase the past decade and begin again with you, I would. February 2009. I need a clean break from all of this. March 2009. Everything will work out. I promise. Trust me. April 2009. May 5th changes everything. May 3rd, 2009, 2 days before the murders. That last message was particularly damning. Chris had told Tara that May 5th would be the day he served divorce papers to Sherry. Instead, it was the day he murdered her. Tara testified that Chris had sent her a text message on the morning of May 5th, shortly after police had discovered the bodies, but before the news had gone public. The message said, "Something terrible has happened. I'll call you when I can." Chris knew his family was dead before he was officially notified because he was the one who killed them. Perhaps most disturbing were the text messages Chris sent Tara during his family's funeral. While sitting at the memorial service for his murdered wife and sons, Chris was texting his mistress that he loved her and missed her. The psychological profile painted a picture of a narcissistic personality with sociopathic tendencies. Dr. Richard Berg, a forensic psychologist, testified that Chris exhibited classic signs: charm and manipulation. Chris was beloved by coworkers, friends, and community members. He presented as helpful, religious, caring. This was a carefully constructed facade. Lack of empathy. Chris showed no genuine grief for his family. His tears during interviews appeared performative. He never asked about how they died, whether they suffered, or showed concern for anyone but himself. Grandiosity. Chris believed he was smarter than investigators. He thought his plan was flawless. He gave interviews to police confident that they would never suspect him. Shallow Chris's emotional responses were inappropriate. He cried at expected times but seemed detached when he thought he wasn't being observed. Pathological lying. Chris lied about everything, big and small, even when the truth would have served him better. Lying was reflexive for him. The profile suggested Chris had likely been fantasizing about killing Sherry for months, possibly longer. The threatening letters weren't just about establishing an outside threat. They were part of his fantasy. He enjoyed the attention, the drama, the control. Look at what Chris Coleman did. Look at how he strangled his wife while she slept, trusted him, never saw it coming. Look at how he murdered his own children. Garrett, 11 years old, and Gavin, 9 years old. Boys who called him dad, who loved him unconditionally. And then look at how he texted his mistress during their funeral. If you can't stand men like this, if you believe children should be protected, if you believe families should mean something, if you believe there's no excuse, no justification for what he did, comment, "I stand with Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin right now." Let Chris Coleman know from his prison cell that his victims are not forgotten. Only narcissists, predators, and people like Chris Coleman, men who value their own pleasure over their children's lives, will scroll past this. Prove you're better? Comment below. The case seemed airtight. The evidence was overwhelming. Chris Coleman was clearly guilty, but then the defense introduced an unexpected twist. Chris's defense attorney, Bill Margulis, argued that while Chris had clearly lied about the affair, that didn't make him a murderer. Yes, he'd been unfaithful. Yes, he'd been planning to leave his wife, but he hadn't killed her. The defense's theory? Someone else committed the murders and framed Chris. Someone who knew about the affair, knew about the threatening letters, and used them to make Chris look guilty. Who? The defense pointed to Tara Lintz. According to this theory, Tara had grown impatient with Chris's stalling about divorce. She'd given him an ultimatum: leave Sherry or lose her. When Chris continued to delay, Tara took matters into her own hands. She flew to St. Louis, drove to the Coleman house, and murdered Chris's family, knowing the police would blame the anonymous threat maker. She then flew back to Florida, establishing her own alibi. The defense produced evidence that Tara had taken a personal day from work on May 4th. She'd told her employer she was sick, but her credit card showed no purchases in Florida that day. No ATM withdrawals, no activity at all. Where was she? The prosecution countered with airline records showing Tara never flew to St. Louis in early May. Security footage from her apartment complex showed her car parked in its usual spot on May 4th and 5th. Her cell phone records showed her phone pinging towers in Florida throughout that period. The defense suggested she could have turned off her phone, left it in Florida, and traveled under a false name. But this theory required believing that Tara booked a flight under a false name, knew where the Coleman house was, she'd never been there, knew how to get inside, Chris had never given her a key, knew where the boys' bedrooms were, knew Chris's schedule well enough to commit the murders during his gym time, knew about the threatening letters well enough to replicate their style, managed to commit 3 murders without leaving any forensic evidence, traveled back to Florida without anyone noticing. It was technically possible, but wildly implausible. The prosecution pointed out that Tara had no motive to frame Chris. She loved him. She wanted to be with him. If Chris was in prison for murder, she'd lose him forever. Why would she destroy the man she loved? The defense's answer: maybe she didn't intend to frame him. Maybe she thought she was helping. Eliminate Sherry, and Chris could finally be free. She didn't realize the evidence would point to him. But this theory fell apart under scrutiny. Tara had cooperated fully with police, turned over her phone and computer, provided evidence that directly incriminated Chris. If she'd committed the murders, why would she provide information that helped convict the man she loved? The jury didn't buy it. The defense's theory was desperate, a Hail Mary attempt to create reasonable doubt where none existed. The real twist wasn't who killed the Coleman family. It was how many people Chris had manipulated along the way. He'd manipulated Sherry, making her believe they had a good marriage, while he planned her death. He'd manipulated his sons, being the dad who played catch and helped with homework, never letting them see the monster underneath. He'd manipulated Tara, making her believe they had a future together, when he was really using her as an excuse for murder. He'd manipulated his employers, playing the faithful employee while violating every moral standard they held. He'd manipulated his neighbors, including Detective Barlow, making them believe he was the victim of threats when he was creating those threats himself. He'd manipulated the police initially, giving interviews designed to point them toward a religious extremist. Chris Coleman was a manipulator, a liar, and a murderer, and he'd almost gotten away with it. On May 19th, 2009, exactly 2 weeks after the murders, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was at his parents' house when police arrived. He'd been staying there since the day of the murders, unable to return to the home where his family had died, or unwilling to face what he'd done. The arrest was quiet, professional. Chris didn't resist. He appeared shocked, as if he genuinely believed the police would never figure it out. "This is wrong," he told the officers. "I didn't do this. I would never hurt my family." But his eyes told a different story. There was calculation there. Already he was thinking about his defense, his strategy, how he would fight this. The evidence against him was laid out in a press conference by Major Jeff Connor of the Illinois State Police. Connor detailed the forensic evidence, the timeline discrepancies, the affair with Tara, the threatening letters written by Chris himself. The public was stunned. In Columbia, Illinois, people had known Chris Coleman. They'd waved to him in the supermarket. Their children had played with Garrett and Gavin. He'd seemed so normal, so devout, so incapable of evil. How does a man kill his own children? The question echoed through the community, through news coverage, through online discussions. People wanted to understand. They needed to make sense of something that made no sense. Forensic psychologists explained that family annihilators, men who kill their entire families, typically share certain characteristics. They're often perceived as good fathers and husbands by those around them. They maintain a facade of normalcy. They kill when they feel backed into a corner, when their carefully controlled image is about to crumble. For Chris Coleman, that moment came when Tara demanded he choose divorce, Sherry, or lose her. And when he realized divorce would mean losing his job, his status, his comfortable life, he chose murder instead. The legal process moved forward. Chris was held without bail. His attorney, Bill Margulis, prepared for what would be one of the highest profile trials in Illinois history. The prosecution team, led by State's Attorney Christopher Kitzman and Assistant State's Attorney Ed Parkinson, built their case methodically. They knew the defense would try to create doubt about the forensic evidence, would argue that the circumstantial nature of some evidence meant Chris could be innocent. So they made sure every piece of evidence was bulletproof. The forensic linguistics analysis was peer-reviewed by multiple experts. All confirmed the same conclusion. Chris wrote the threatening letters. The DNA evidence was retested, same results. The timeline was reconstructed minute by minute using cell phone tower data, security footage, key card records, and witness statements. No gaps, no ambiguity. The affair with Tara was documented in excruciating detail. Photos, videos, text messages, emails, phone records. Everything showed that Chris had been living a double life and had chosen Tara over his family. Sherry's family prepared victim impact statements. Her brother, Mario DeChico, spoke to reporters about his sister. She was kind, he said. She trusted Chris completely. She never suspected he could hurt her. She died believing her husband loved her, Mario said, his voice breaking. He took that from her. He took everything. Joyce Meyer's organization released a statement expressing shock and grief. They'd trusted Chris with Joyce's safety, with the security of their entire ministry. The betrayal was profound. "We extend our deepest sympathies to the families of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman," the statement read. "We are cooperating fully with law enforcement and believe justice will be served." Quietly, Joyce Meyer Ministries reviewed their security protocols. How had they missed the signs? How had a man planning to murder his family passed their background checks, their evaluations? The answer was chilling. Chris Coleman was good at hiding who he really was. He'd spent years perfecting his mask. By the time cracks began to show, it was too late. As the trial date approached, the prosecution prepared their witnesses. Tara Lintz would testify. Despite her complicated role in the case, she'd been a victim of Chris's manipulation too, even if she'd enabled his affair. Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow would testify about the threatening letters, about his attempts to protect the Coleman family, about his failure to see the threat was coming from inside the house. Forensic experts would explain the DNA evidence, the fiber analysis, the computer searches. Joyce Meyer's employees would testify about the ministry's policies on adultery and divorce, establishing Chris's motive. The medical examiner would describe how Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin died, slowly, painfully, aware of what was happening to them. This last part was crucial. The prosecution needed the jury to understand that these weren't quick, painless deaths. Chris had strangled each victim individually. He'd felt them struggle, heard them fight for breath, looked into their eyes as they died. Garrett and Gavin had known their father was killing them. That knowledge made the crime somehow worse. Not just murder, but betrayal at its most fundamental level. The trial was scheduled to begin on April 28, 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders. 2 years of waiting for justice. 2 years of Sherry's family grieving, of the boys' grandparents living with the horror of what had happened. 2 years of Chris Coleman sitting in jail, maintaining his innocence, telling anyone who would listen that he was being framed. But the evidence was ready. The witnesses were prepared. The prosecution was confident. Chris Coleman would finally face judgment for what he'd done. The trial began on April 28, 2011, in a packed courtroom in Monroe County, Illinois. Media from across the country descended on the small courthouse. This case had everything that captivated public attention: family murder, religious hypocrisy, affair, a seemingly perfect facade hiding absolute evil. Chris Coleman sat at the defense table in a suit and tie, looking every bit the clean-cut former Marine. He'd lost weight during his 2 years in jail. His face had a drawn, haunted quality, but he maintained the same calm demeanor he'd shown during his initial police interviews. Confident, almost arrogant, Judge Milton Wharton presided over the trial with stern efficiency. The jury selection had taken weeks, finding 12 people who hadn't already formed strong opinions about Chris Coleman's guilt or innocence. The final jury, 7 women, 5 men, ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s, a cross-section of Monroe County, people who would decide if Chris lived or died. Illinois still had the death penalty in May 2011, though it would be repealed just months later. The prosecution was seeking it. Opening statements laid out the case clearly. Prosecutor Ed Parkinson spoke directly to the jury. The evidence will show that Chris Coleman planned and executed the murder of his wife and 2 young sons. He did it because he wanted to be with his mistress. He did it because a divorce would cost him his job. He did it because he valued his own pleasure more than his children's lives. The evidence is overwhelming. The timeline is clear. The motive is obvious. Chris Coleman is guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Defense attorney Bill Margulis countered, "The state wants you to believe that a man with no history of violence, a decorated Marine, a father who loved his children, suddenly became a monster. They want you to ignore that someone else had access to this house. They want you to convict based on an affair, not on proof of murder. An affair makes Chris Coleman a bad husband. It doesn't make him a murderer. The state's case is built on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. We will prove there is reasonable doubt." The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks. Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow testified first, describing the threatening letters, his security camera footage, the morning he discovered the bodies. His voice cracked when describing what he'd found in the boys' bedrooms. "I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, Barlow said. "I've seen terrible things. But those children, Garrett and Gavin, knowing they died that way, knowing their own father did it, I'll never forget it." The forensic pathologist, Dr. Raj Nanduri, provided clinical details about the murders. Each victim had been strangled using a ligature, likely a cord or rope. The strangulation was manual and prolonged, taking 3 to 5 minutes per victim. This wasn't instantaneous, Dr. Nanduri explained. Each victim would have been conscious and aware for at least the first minute or 2. They would have struggled. They would have been terrified. The jury looked uncomfortable. Several members glanced at Chris, trying to reconcile the man in the suit with someone capable of strangling 2 children. Chris stared straight ahead, emotionless. The computer forensics expert, Michael Wessel, walked the jury through Chris's internet searches, projected on a screen for everyone to see: how to commit murder without getting caught, ligature strangulation time, do police always catch murderers, life insurance payout after murder. Each search was time-stamped. Each one happened in the months before the murders. The jury took notes. Dr. Carol Chasky, the forensic linguistics expert, testified about the threatening letters. She explained in detail how writing analysis works, why it's reliable, why the probability that someone other than Chris wrote those letters was statistically negligible. "Every person has a unique writing fingerprint," she said. "Chris Coleman's fingerprint is all over those threatening letters. He wrote them to himself, there is no doubt." The defense tried to challenge her methodology, but she was unshakable. She'd analyzed thousands of documents in her career. She knew what she was doing, and she was certain Chris was the author. Tara Lintz took the stand On day 8 of the trial, she wore a black dress and the promise ring Chris had given her. This detail wasn't lost on anyone, especially Sherry's family sitting in the front row. Tara cried throughout her testimony. She admitted to the affair, apologized for it, said she'd been stupid and selfish and never imagined it would lead to this. "Did Chris ever tell you he wanted to hurt his family?" Prosecutor Parkinson asked. "No," Tara said. "Never. He said he wanted a divorce. He said we were going to be together." "Did he ever actually file for divorce?" "No." "Did he ever meet with a divorce attorney?" "Not that I know of." "Did he ever do anything concrete to leave his wife?" "No." "But he killed her instead, didn't he?" "Objection!" Bill Margulis shouted, leading the witness, assuming facts, not in evidence. "Sustained," Judge Wharton ruled. "Rephrase, Counselor." Parkinson looked at Tara. "Ms. Lintz, you believed Chris was going to serve Sherry with divorce papers on May 5th, correct?" "Yes." "And instead, on May 5th, Sherry died." "Yes." "And that's when you realized you'd been lied to." Tara's face crumpled. "Yes." The defense cross-examined Tara aggressively, trying to suggest she could have committed the murders herself. But Tara had alibis, records, evidence proving she was in Florida. The jury didn't buy the defense's theory. Joyce Meyer's employees testified about the ministry's policies, about Chris's affair being discovered, about the lie he told regarding Tara's fictional husband. Christine Reed, who'd helped discover the affair, testified that Chris had specifically asked about privacy settings on his work phone. "He wanted to know if anyone could see photos sent to his phone," she said. "I told him no. Now I realize he was sending explicit photos with Tara and wanted to make sure no one at work could see them." "Did the ministry have policies about adultery?" Parkinson asked. "Yes, it's grounds for immediate termination. So if Chris had gotten divorced due to an affair, he would have lost his job?" "Almost certainly." This established motive clearly. Chris needed his family gone, not just divorced. The physical evidence was presented. The spray paint cans with Chris's DNA, the ligature with fibers from his clothes, the scratches on his arms, matching defensive wounds on Sherry's hands. The timeline evidence was devastating. Cell tower data, security footage, keycard logs, all showing Chris had lied about his whereabouts during the murders. The prosecution rested after 17 days of testimony. The defense's case lasted only 3 days. Bill Margulis called character witnesses who testified that Chris was a good father, a dedicated employee, a man of faith. But none of them could refute the physical evidence. None of them could explain the computer searches or the threatening letters in Chris's own writing. The defense's forensic expert tried to cast doubt on the linguistic analysis but was thoroughly dismantled on cross-examination. Chris Coleman did not testify in his own defense. His attorney advised against it. On the stand, under aggressive cross-examination, Chris's lies would unravel. Better to stay silent. Closing arguments were powerful. Ed Parkinson spoke to the jury for 2 hours, walking them through every piece of evidence, every lie Chris had told, every manipulation he'd attempted. Chris Coleman didn't just kill his wife and children, Parkinson said. He planned it for months. He created an elaborate scheme to frame a non-existent religious extremist. He spray-painted his own walls with threats. He threw away his children's lives so he could be with his mistress and keep his comfortable job. He strangled Garrett and Gavin while they slept, while they trusted him, while they called him daddy. He felt them die. He heard them struggle. And then he threw their bodies away like trash, went to the gym, and played the victim. That's not a good man who made a terrible mistake. That's a cold-blooded murderer. Find him guilty. Give Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin the justice they deserve. The jury received the case on May 3rd, 2011. They deliberated for 15 hours over 2 days. At first, they were split. 7 jurors believed guilty. 5 weren't sure. The circumstantial nature of some evidence troubled them. There was no confession, no eyewitness, no smoking gun. They sent a note to Judge Wharton. "We are a hung jury." Wharton sent them back to deliberate more. On the second day, several jurors re-examined the photo evidence from Tara's phone. They found the picture of Chris and Tara kissing, dated October 21st, 2008. Both Chris and Tara had testified the affair started in late November. This photo proved they'd been lying. They'd been together before the threatening letters started. If Chris lied about that, what else was he lying about? The jury reconsidered everything through this lens. Chris was a liar. He'd lied to his wife, his mistress, his employers, the police, and the jury. Why should they believe anything he said? On May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years after the murders, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood. "On the count of first-degree murder of Sherry Coleman, we find the defendant guilty." Sherry's family gasped. Some cried. Chris stared straight ahead, yawns, expressionless. On the count of first-degree murder of Garrett Coleman, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of first-degree murder of Gavin Coleman, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all 3 counts. Chris Coleman showed no emotion, no tears, no anger, nothing. Sentencing came 4 weeks later. Judge Wharton had the option to sentence Chris to death or life in prison without possibility of parole. Sherry's brother, Mario DeChico, gave a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears. "Sherry was my little sister," he said, his voice breaking. "She was kind and funny and loved those boys more than anything in the world. Garrett and Gavin were just babies. They had their whole lives ahead of them, and Chris took that away. He didn't just kill them, he erased their futures. Every birthday they won't have. But every graduation, every wedding, every grandchild. He stole all of it because he wanted to sleep with another woman. There's no punishment severe enough for what he did, but I'm asking you to make sure he never walks free again. Make sure he dies in prison like he made my sister and her boys die in their beds." Chris's father, Pastor Ron Coleman, gave his own statement, still maintaining his son's innocence. "Chris is not a murderer," Ron said. "He loved his family. I believe he's innocent and this verdict is wrong, but I also know God has a plan and we trust in that." Some in the courtroom found this statement tone-deaf and infuriating. Chris had been convicted based on overwhelming evidence and his father was still defending him. Judge Wharton sentenced Chris Coleman to life in prison without possibility of parole on each count, to be served consecutively, technically 3 life sentences, but with no parole possible. It meant the same thing. Chris would die in prison. Illinois would repeal the death penalty 3 months later. If Chris's trial had been delayed just a few months, death wouldn't have even been on the table. Some saw this as Chris getting lucky. Others saw it as appropriate. Life in prison meant decades to think about what he'd done, to live with the knowledge that he'd murdered his own children. Death would have been quicker. This was slower justice. Chris was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He glanced once at Tara, who was crying in the gallery. Then he was gone. He filed an appeal in 2013, arguing ineffective counsel and improper admission of evidence. The appeal was denied. He filed another appeal in 2016, also denied. Chris Coleman remains in prison today, housed at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Ironically, it's the same prison where another family annihilator resides. Chris Watts, who murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters in 2018, 2 Chris Colemans, 2 family killers, 2 men who chose murder over divorce. Unanswered questions. Despite the conviction, certain questions about the Coleman case remain unresolved. Why did Chris choose strangulation? He was a trained Marine with access to firearms through his security work. Strangulation is personal, intimate, requiring sustained physical contact with the victim. Was this a choice made to avoid noise, or did Chris want to feel them die? Forensic psychologists suggest the latter. Family annihilators often choose methods that require proximity, because on some level, they want to be present for the deaths. It's about control, about power, about erasing the people who represent their trapped life. When exactly did Chris decide to commit murder? The threatening letters began in November 2008, shortly after meeting Tara. This suggests the plan was forming even then. But did he intend to kill them from the beginning? Or did the plan evolve as the affair progressed and divorce became less feasible? The prosecution argued Chris had been planning for months, but some forensic psychologists believe the decision might have crystallized much more recently, perhaps only days before May 5th. The May 4th sick day suggests final preparations, last-minute planning. We'll never know for certain because Chris has never confessed. What would have happened if Joyce Meyer's organization had fired Chris when they discovered the affair? Would Sherry and the boys still be alive? Or would Chris have murdered them anyway, no longer having a job to protect? Christine Reed, who helped discover Chris's affair, has spoken about this in interviews. She carries guilt, wondering if reporting the affair more forcefully could have changed the outcome. "We gave him the benefit of the doubt," she said. "We believed his lie about Tara's fictional husband. If we'd pushed harder, if we'd done more, maybe those children would still be here." But Chris's manipulation wasn't her fault. He was a skilled liar who'd fooled everyone around him for years. Did Tara suspect what Chris was capable of? Looking back at their text messages, certain phrases seem ominous. Chris's promise that May 5th changes everything. His assurances that everything would work out. His requests that Tara trust him. Tara insists she never imagined Chris would hurt his family. She thought divorce papers meant actual divorce, not murder. But some observers question whether she was truly that naive. Could she have known, on some level, what Chris was planning? Tara has never been charged with any crime related to the murders. The evidence suggests she genuinely believed Chris was getting divorced. But the question lingers. Why did Chris spray paint the walls? The threatening messages were part of his cover story, but they were also unnecessary. He could have simply made it look like a home invasion, a burglary gone wrong. Why add the elaborate staging with religious references? Again, psychologists point to narcissism. Chris enjoyed the drama, the complexity of his plan, the way he'd been building toward this moment for months. The spray-painted walls were the culmination of his theatrical performance. And perhaps there was something else. Chris wanted credit. He wanted people to see how clever he'd been, how he'd manipulated everyone. The spray-painted messages were his signature on a crime he believed would never be traced to him. How did Garrett and Gavin die? The medical examiner determined they were strangled in their beds, but we don't know if they woke up, if they struggled, if they understood what was happening. The prosecution argued they must have known. The ligature marks showed signs of struggle. Their bodies showed defensive positioning. They died knowing their father was killing them. This detail haunts everyone involved in the case. Judge Wharton later said it was one of the most disturbing cases he'd ever presided over, specifically because of the children. They trusted him completely, Wharton said, and he betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. What was Chris thinking as he strangled his sons? Did he hesitate? Did some part of him recoil from what he was doing? Or was he completely committed, focused only on his goal of starting a new life with Tara? We know he was methodical. He killed Sherry first, then moved to Garrett's room, then Gavin's. This wasn't frenzied or panicked. This was calculated. But what was going through his mind remains a mystery. He's never spoken about it publicly. Finally, does Chris feel remorse? He's maintained his innocence throughout his imprisonment, telling anyone who will listen that he was framed, that the evidence was misinterpreted, that he loved his family and would never hurt them. But those who've seen recent photos of Chris note something interesting. He's aged dramatically. He looks haunted. Some prison officials report that he has nightmares, that he's withdrawn from other inmates, that he spends most of his time alone. Is this guilt, or is it simply the reality of spending life in prison? We may never know what truly goes through Chris Coleman's mind, whether he's capable of feeling genuine remorse or whether his narcissism prevents him from accepting responsibility. What we do know is that 3 innocent people are dead. Sherry Garrett and Gavin Coleman deserved better than the man who was supposed to protect them. Chris Coleman wanted to be forgotten. He wanted to serve his sentence in quiet obscurity, avoiding the attention, avoiding the judgment. He wanted Sherry Garrett and Gavin to fade from memory, to become just another tragic news story that people scrolled past. If you believe they mattered, if you believe we must remember, so this never happens again, smash that like button and subscribe. Men like Chris Coleman depend on our silence, our short attention spans, our willingness to move on to the next headline. Prove him wrong. Like if you believe every life matters, that children deserve protection, that monsters shouldn't be allowed to hide. Only people who side with family annihilators, who make excuses for abusers, who value convenience over children's lives will refuse. Subscribe right now. Make sure when the next perfect father starts planning murder, the world is paying attention. The Coleman family murders exposed how easily evil can hide behind a facade of normalcy. Chris Coleman was a Marine, a Christian, a security professional, trusted to protect one of America's most prominent religious leaders. He seemed like the last person who would murder his family. But that's exactly what makes cases like this so terrifying. Family annihilation is more common than most people realize. Every year in the United States, dozens of men kill their entire families. The FBI estimates there are between 20 and 30 cases annually, though some experts believe the actual number is higher. These killers share common characteristics. They're often seen as good fathers and providers. They maintain appearances of strong marriages. They're active in their communities. They kill when they feel trapped, when the life they've built is about to crumble, when they see no other way out. Chris Coleman fit this profile perfectly. The Coleman case also highlighted the danger of conflating religious appearance with actual morality. Chris worked for a Christian ministry, attended church regularly, spoke the language of faith. This made people trust him, made them less likely to suspect he was capable of violence. But religious affiliation doesn't prevent evil. Some of the worst crimes in history have been committed by people who claimed faith. The case changed Columbia, Illinois forever. The quiet suburb would never feel quite as safe again. Neighbors looked at each other differently, wondering what might be hidden behind closed doors. Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow, who'd tried so hard to protect the Coleman family, retired from law enforcement shortly after the trial. The case had broken something in him, the knowledge that he'd been investigating the wrong suspect while the real killer lived 3 houses away. "I saw Chris almost every day," Barlow said in an interview years later. "We talked about the threats, about keeping his family safe. I never suspected him. I should have. That's something I'll live with forever." Joyce Meyer Ministries instituted new security protocols and background check procedures after the case. They also added psychological evaluations for security staff, trying to identify potential red flags before hiring. Tara Lintz disappeared from public view after the trial. She changed her name, moved to a different state, tried to rebuild a life away from the scrutiny and judgment. She gave one interview years later, saying she thought about Sherry and the boys every day, wishing she could take back her role in the tragedy. "I didn't kill them," she said, "but I'm not innocent either. If I hadn't been involved with Chris, if I hadn't pushed him about marriage, maybe he wouldn't have, maybe they'd still be alive." The wrongful death lawsuit filed by Sherry's family against Joyce Meyer Ministries was dismissed in 2013. The court ruled that the ministry couldn't have reasonably known Chris was dangerous, that he'd successfully fooled everyone around him, including trained professionals. Sherry's family used Chris's life insurance payout and victim compensation funds to establish a foundation in memory of Garrett and Gavin. The foundation provides support for children who've lost parents to violence. "Those boys deserve to grow up," Mario DeChico said at the foundation's launch. "They deserve to have futures. Since Chris took that away, we're going to honor their memory by helping other children survive and thrive." That's what Sherry would have wanted. Chris Coleman's case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries and podcasts. It's often compared to the Chris Watts case, both in the similarity of names and the parallel circumstances. Men who murdered their families to be with mistresses, men who maintained facades of perfect family life while planning murder. Both Chris Coleman and Chris Watts are housed at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Whether they've ever met or spoken is unknown, but the irony of 2 family annihilators, named Chris, serving life sentences at the same prison hasn't been lost on true crime observers. The case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous threats often come from the people we trust most, from inside our homes, from those who claim to love us. Sherry Coleman trusted her husband completely. She never suspected he was writing threatening letters to himself. She never imagined he would hurt her or their children. That trust cost her everything. Garrett and Gavin Coleman trusted their father completely. They went to bed on May 4th, 2009, secure in the knowledge that their dad would keep them safe. They never imagined he was the danger. That trust cost them their lives. And that's perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case. It wasn't a stranger who murdered the Coleman family. It wasn't a religious extremist or a home invader or a random act of violence. It was the man who vowed to protect them, the man who was supposed to love them more than anyone in the world, the man they called husband and father. Chris Coleman, Sherry Coleman, 31 years old, described by everyone who knew her as kind, loving, dedicated to her children. She loved scrapbooking and creating memory albums. She loved sunny mornings and coffee on the back porch. She loved her boys more than anything. Garrett Coleman, 11 years old, he wanted to be a Marine, like his father. He collected rocks and labeled them carefully. He was kind to kids who were bullied. He had his mother's laugh and his father's discipline. Gavin Coleman, 9 years old. He liked building with Legos and following instructions exactly. He was particular about his belongings. He was quieter than his brother, but just as sweet. He had his entire life ahead of him, gone but not forgotten.